Welcome to MTG Burgeoning, a channel for all things magic. In this video, we are going to discuss the quintessential cards needed to build the core of a Juggernaut tribal commander deck with Graaz Unstoppable Juggernaut as its general. Graaz Unstoppable Juggernaut made its debut in Phyrexia All Will Be One and is a 7/5 Juggernaut for 8 mana. Juggernauts we control attack each turn if able and can't be blocked by walls. Other creatures we control have base power and toughness of 5/3 and are Juggernauts in addition to their other types. It's a good thing that Graaz makes other creatures we control Juggernauts, because aside from our general, at this moment, there are less than 20 other playable Juggernauts in Magic that fit into a colorless commander build helmed by Graaz. This includes artifact creatures that have Changeling as well. Since our general makes other creatures Juggernauts, in addition to changing the base power and toughness of these creatures to 5/3, the goal for the core of this build is simple. We want to fill our side of the battlefield with numerous cheap and/or evasive creatures and include spells that have burst creature token production. Together, alongside some potent artifact synergies, we will use our army of Juggernauts to overwhelm our opponents and claim victory. We begin the core of this build with a smattering of creature spells. Ornithopter flies, and although evasion is valuable, not all of our creatures need it if the price is right. Phyrexian Walker and Memnite have no evasion, but have mana values of 0. For creatures that become 5/3 in the presence of our general, these freebies are worthy of inclusion. Other considerations include Inquisitive Puppet, which has an exile ability that creates a 1/1 white human creature token. With Graaz, that's 1/5/3 after another for the overall investment of just 1 mana. Plus, the puppet scries 1 when it comes into play. Mere Sire leaves behind a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Mirror artifact creature token when it dies. As 5/3 creatures with Infect, it wouldn't take long for an opponent to succumb to poison counters from the likes of Necropede, Ichor Claw Mirror, and Plague Mirror. The additional utility effects of a -1/-1 counter, temporary power and toughness boosts, and mana ramp increase the value level of these 2-drops. Hope of Jirapur flies and has a sacrifice ability that shuts down an opponent from casting non-creature spells until our next turn, as long as that player was dealt combat damage by it this turn. Ornithopter of Paradise also has evasion and taps for 1 mana of any color. Arcbound Stinger has flying and gets a +1/+1 counter on it when it comes into play due to its modular ability, while Hovermere has both flying and vigilance. Signal Pest can be blocked only by creatures with flying or reach, while Gingerbrute has an activated ability where it cannot be blocked except by creatures with haste until end of turn. Signal Pest also has Battlecry, so whenever it attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn, making each of those attacking Juggernauts at least a 6/3. Etched Champion is a bit pricier at 3 mana, but it has protection from all colors through its Metalcraft ability, as long as we control at least 3 artifacts, an easily achievable feat in this build. Stonecoil Serpent has protection from multicolored in addition to reach and trample. It enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. It should be noted that in the presence of Graaz, Stonecoil Serpent's power and toughness change to 5/3, but it still has +1/+1 counters on it, creating the potential for a very big trampling snake. Next up are some creature token producing spells and effects. Both Nimble Right Schematic and Servo Schematic create 1/1 creature tokens when they enter the battlefield or are put into the graveyard. As a much beefier option, when Phyrexian Triniform dies, we create 3/3/3 colorless golems. Its Encore ability makes it even more dangerous to our opponents. If we pay 12 when it's in our graveyard and exile it, which we can only do as a sorcery, then we create a token copy of Phyrexian Triniform for each opponent. These token copies have haste, and each one attacks that opponent this turn if able. At the beginning of the next end step, we sacrifice these token copies. Each token has a death trigger, and we create 3/3/3 colorless golems for each copy of Phyrexian Triniform. If we have 3 opponents, then we create 9 of these 3/3 golems. Graaz approves. For the investment of 7 mana, Skittering Invasion creates 5/0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawns that can be sacrificed for colorless mana, while Mascot Exhibition creates a 2/1 white and black Inkling with flying, a 3/2 red and white Spirit, and a 4/4 blue and red Elemental. The combined 14 mana needed to cast these 2 spells net us a combined 40 power and 24 toughness stretched across 8 Juggernaut bodies in the presence of Graaz. When Mirror Battlesphere comes into play, we create 4 1/1 colorless Mirror, which we could tap upon the Battlesphere's declaration of attack and give it +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is equal to the number of Mirror we tapped this way. It deals X damage to defending player. When Canoptic Scarab Swarm enters the battlefield, we exile target player's graveyard. For each artifact or land card exiled this way, we create a 1/1 colorless insect. Pentavis enters the battlefield with 5 +1/+1 counters on it. We can pay 1 and remove one of these +1/+1 counters and create a colorless 1/1 Pentavite with flying. We also can pay 1, sacrifice a Pentavite, and put a +1/+1 counter back onto Pentavis. This can cause a lot of headaches for our opponents during combat. At the beginning of our upkeep, if we don't control any Thopters other than Thopter Assembly, then we return it to our hand and create 5 1/1 colorless Thopters with flying. For a slower buildup of creature tokens, Hangerback Walker enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. Whenever it dies, we create a colorless 1/1 Thopter with flying for each +1/+1 counter on it. As a bonus, we can pay 1, tap it, and put a +1/+1 counter on it. An early game Hangerback Walker could equal numerous late game 5/3 flying Juggernauts. Snake Basket has a similar one and done token producing ability. We pay X, sacrifice it, and create X 1/1 green snakes. This is an ability that we can activate only as a sorcery. For repeatable sources of creature token production, Nuisance Engine creates 0/1 colorless pests, Throne of Empires creates 1/1 white soldiers, Acorn Catapult creates 1/1 green squirrels, and Trading Post creates 0/1 white goats, in addition to a slate of other abilities which include life gain, artifact recursion, and card draw. Since this build is strong with artifacts, Golem Foundry has the potential to create a slew of 3/3 colorless golems. Whenever we cast an artifact spell, we put a charge counter on Golem Factory. If we remove 3 charge counters from it, then we create a 3/3 colorless golem. The earlier we get this artifact onto the battlefield, the better. There are lands that offer repeatable sources of creature token production as well. We can pay 3 and tap Mirix to create a 1/1 Phyrexian Might with Toxic 1, meaning that if it deals combat damage to a player, that player gets a poison counter. Field of the Dead creates a 2/2 black zombie whenever a land we control enters the battlefield, as long as we control at least 7 lands with different names. This should not be a problem in a colorless deck. We love being rewarded for engaging in basic fundamentals of the game, like playing lands. Speaking of lands, we also can use them for the purposes of beefing up the numbers of Graaz's army of Juggernauts. For 1 mana and until end of turn, Blinkmoth Nexus becomes a 1/1 artifact creature with flying. Inkmoth Nexus does the same but also has Infect, while Mishra's Factory and Munivault become 2/2s. Mishra's Foundry has an activation cost of 2 mana in order to become a 2/2, while Crawling Barrens' activated cost is a bit steeper at 4 mana, but we do put 2+1/+1 counters on it, making this land an even bigger threat in the presence of Graaz. Now let's focus on tempo. Foundry Inspector reduces the casting cost of our artifact spells by 1. Cloud Key can do the same, while Joyra's Familiar extends this cost reduction to our legendary spells and sagas as well. Eugen the Ineffable's static ability reduces the casting cost of all of our colorless spells by 2. We also can activate Eugen's +2 loyalty ability and exile the top card of our library face down and look at it. We create a 2/2 colorless spirit creature token, and when that token leaves the battlefield, we put the exile card into our hand. This ability provides additional Juggernaut to be recruits for Graaz's army, in addition to potential card advantage. Eugen's other loyalty ability destroys target permanent that's 1 or more colors. Targeted removal is welcomed with arms wide open in any colorless brew. As we continue our tempo trend, let's include some creatures that can cast our spells ahead of curve. Hedron Crawler and Mannequin have mana values of 2 and can tap to add a colorless mana, while Automated Artificer does the same, but this mana can only be used to activate an ability or to cast an artifact spell. For 1 more mana, Palladium Mirror taps to add 2 colorless mana. Wandering Archaic allows us to piggyback on our opponent's spell slinging, unless they pay an additional 2 mana each time they cast an instant or sorcery spell. If they choose not to, then we copy their spell and may choose new targets for the copy. We must resist the urge to fill out the entire land base of this build with non-basic lands. If we include multiple copies of Wastes, then we should be able to benefit from our opponent's land ramp spells with Wandering Archaic. Since we're mentioning basic lands, including Solemn Simulacrum and Burnished Heart provide our own mana ramp resources. Thus far, we have demonstrated the ability to create a large army. We can use portions of this army to accelerate us ahead of our opponents even further with Quark Clan Ironworks and Ashnod's Altar. KCI allows us to sacrifice an artifact for 2 colorless mana, while the Altar gives us 2 colorless mana whenever we sacrifice a creature to it. The core of this build is inundated with artifact and creature spells, in addition to numerous abilities that create them. Since the mana value of our general is a Juggernaut-like 8 mana, we should have little trouble summoning Graaz from the command zone with these artifacts and a host of sacrifice fodder on our side of the battlefield. Let's bring this video to a close by including some cards that synergize with and enhance our theme. Chief of the Foundry gives other artifact creatures we control +1/+1, while Steel Overseer can tap to put a +1/+1 counter on each artifact creature we control. Notice that these boosts to the power and toughness of our creatures are augmented even further in the presence of Graaz. Speaking of power and toughness boosts, Forsaken Monument gives colorless creatures we control +2/+2. We also add an additional colorless mana whenever we tap a permanent for colorless mana, and we gain 2 life whenever we cast a colorless spell. Eldrazi Conscription is an aura that gives enchanted creature +10/+10, trample, and Annihilator 2, meaning that whenever it attacks, defending player sacrifices 2 permanents. Shimmermere allows us to cast artifact spells as though they had flash, while Liberator, Urza's Battlethopter, extends this flash enablement to include all colorless spells we cast. In the case of Liberator, its evasion and evolve-like mechanic of getting a +1/+1 counter whenever we cast a spell with a mana value greater than Liberator's power makes it a reasonable threat to our opponents. Speaking of +1/+1 counters, whenever another artifact enters the battlefield, we put a +1/+1 counter on Arcbound Crusher. Notice that Arcbound Crusher gets a +1/+1 counter whenever any artifact comes into play, and not just ours. It also has Trample and Modular 1, which means that it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, and when it dies, we can put its +1/+1 counters on target artifact creature. With its +1/+1 counter ability, Trample, and ability of transferring these +1/+1 counters to another target artifact creature upon its death, Arcbound Crusher could become a serious threat at the table. Mystic Forge extends our hand to include the top of our library, as we may look at the top card of our library at any time, and we may cast artifact or colorless spells from the top of our library. If we don't like what we see, then we can pay 1 life, tap Mystic Forge, and exile the top card of our library. We can use Kuldotha Forgemaster to cheat an artifact card from our library onto the battlefield by tapping it and sacrificing 3 artifacts. Commander's Plate gives our general protection from all colors and can lead to a potential one-shotting of an opponent with lethal commander damage. Crypto Thrall gives other artifact creatures we control hexproof, while Darksteel Forge gives all of our artifacts indestructible. All is Dust is a color-specific board wipe that should leave our side of the battlefield relatively unharmed, while Eugen the Spirit Dragon's X ability makes each player exile each permanent with mana value of X or less that's 1 or more colors. This effect could be devastating to our opponents while, once again, leaving our side of the battlefield relatively unchanged. Eugen's other loyalty abilities include dealing 3 damage to any target and gaining 7 life, drawing 7 cards, and putting 7 permanent cards from our hand onto the battlefield. Lastly, since spot removal generally is lacking in a colorless themed deck, we can play Karn Liberated to help shore up this weakness. Karn exiles a target permanent or exiles a card from that player's hand. Or we leave in exile all non-aura permanent cards exiled by Karn, restart the game, and then put those cards onto the battlefield under our control. Whether or not we restart the game with Karn, our opponents will want to restart it after getting thoroughly stomped on by Graaz and his army of Juggernauts. This video provided a blueprint for building the core of a Juggernaut tribal commander deck around Graaz Unstoppable Juggernaut as its general. Removal spells, disruption, ramp, and the land base can vary from build to build, and also are dependent on metagame preferences and availability. The cards discussed during this video are suggested options for crafting the core of a Juggernaut tribal EDH deck, in addition to providing ways to optimize this theme. Let me know your thoughts about these recommendations in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic.